Hey, this is Troy, and today I'm going to be talking about how the engine in your car works. So to start off with, if you walk outside and pop the hood of your car, you should see something that looks a little bit like this diagram here on the right. The main components that I'm going to be talking about today are the engine, which is right here in the red square. I'm also going to be talking about a little bit in the intake right here, which the intake is basically just a box that lets air in. It filters the air, and then it goes into the engine because it's needed for the engine to run. And then also right here, in this lower rectangle, we have what's called the exhaust manifold, which takes the fumes from the engine and takes them out of your car. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the individual parts of the engine itself. Mainly what we have here is the block, which is comprised of the lower and upper end of the block. The lower end, which is this bigger part, holds the crankshaft and the pistons and all of the parts in the lower side of the engine, while the upper part, the smaller rectangle up here, holds the smaller and more fragile parts, such as the valve springs and such. We also have the exhaust manifold right here, as I was talking about earlier, which takes the dirty gases out of the engine and takes them away from your car. And then we also have the intake manifold up here, which takes the air into the engine and lets the engine run. So I'm going to be talking about the internals of an internal combustion engine as labeled here. So in this image we have the overall block, as we can see, which I was talking about earlier, the lower and upper end. The lower end is from here down, and the upper end is here and up. So we have the piston and the connecting rod and the crankshaft right here, that system. And then we have the valve springs up here and the spark plug as well. So there's 4 main strokes of an engine that is in all cars nowadays. And they are, first, intake. Sorry for the handwriting. See if I can that better. There you go. Intake, which, as talked about earlier, this is whenever the engine takes in a mixture of air and fuel into the engine. So then the second stroke we have is compression. So what happens with compression is this piston and connecting rod down here that I've talked about is on its way up, and that compresses the air and fuel mixture in this chamber. Let's see if I can change colors real quick. In here, so this fuel and air mixture is compressed, and then after a certain point it explodes. And that's why it's called an internal combustion engine, because it combusts within the engine. So after this explosion, we have the next step in the process, which is that of the explosion. So as I just said, after these gases compress to a certain point, then the spark plug up here fires a spark, igniting the gases, and it explodes. So then our last and final step is the exhaust. So in this exhaust stroke, we have all of these gases that have just been created by an explosion within the block in here. And that's whenever the piston comes back down from the force of the explosion. And this valve spring up here opens up and lets the air and fumes out of the engine. So in review, the engine takes in air and fuel here, and then it compresses it, ignites it via the spark plug, explodes to create fumes, and then it leaves the engine on the other side. So the whole process of this combustion is really used to turn this crankshaft on the bottom. Whenever we turn this crankshaft, that's what makes the actual power that turns the wheels on the car. So that's what's up next, the conversion. Now I'm going to draw a diagram, or attempt to draw a diagram, of a car. Might be a little rough. This is from an aerial view, and these 4 blocks are tires. So now I'm going to draw the connecting axles on each side. See if I can make those a little thicker. And in the middle here, we have the engine, which is going to be in blue, as I just talked to you about. So in this engine, fumes, air and fuel are combusted to create motion at the crankshaft. And the engine is connected to this other rectangle. It's called a transmission, and that's just what takes the power from the engine and connects it to the drive shaft. And the drive shaft here is going to be in red, and it is just connecting to the transmission and the rear tires in this case. So we have the engine, which turns the crankshaft, which it goes to the transmission, which in turn rotates this drive shaft. And this drive shaft, what it's going to do is rotate in circles. And it rotates in circles, and it's connected to this rear box, which is called a differential. The differential just converts the power from the drive shaft into power that can be used by both of these tires. So that's it. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you know a little bit more about the car you drive.